Your name is written in a file somewhere, stored in a system you never consented to, marked with codes you will never see, flagged for reasons no one will ever explain to you. This is not a thought experiment. This is what happened to thousands of ordinary people whose only crime was being noticed by an algorithm. Be an analyst by a neighbor who made a call. The files exist, released decades later through Freedom of Information requests, redacted but readable. And they tell a story about how easily a life can be marked and how permanent that mark becomes. These were not terrorists, not criminals, not spies. They were teachers who attended the wrong protest, students who read the wrong books, veterans who asked uncomfortable questions about wars they fought. They were flagged, and once flagged, they entered a system designed never to let them go. A system that followed them through jobs, through moves, through marriages, documenting their lives with a thoroughness that feels obscene. The feeling you have right now, that tightness in your chest, that quiet fear that maybe you have done something, said something, been somewhere that could have marked you. That feeling is the point, because control does not require prison. It requires the belief that you are being watched, that someone is keeping track, that stepping out of line carries consequences you cannot see, but can always feel. In 1973, a man named Robert applied for a government job, a simple clerical position that should have taken weeks to process, but instead stretched into months of silence and eventually a rejection with no explanation given. He appealed, he wrote letters, he demanded to know why, and the answer that finally came was not an answer at all. Just a form letter stating that his application had been carefully reviewed and found unsuitable. It was not until 30 years later, when the files were partially declassified, that Robert discovered his name had been on a watch list since he was 19 years old. The reason: he had attended a single anti-war rally in college, stood in a crowd of thousands, and someone had taken his photograph, recorded his name from a sign-in sheet, and entered him into a system. That single afternoon, that one moment of civic engagement, had marked him for surveillance that lasted decades, that followed him through 7 different addresses, 3 marriages, and a career he was never allowed to pursue. The file contained details that made him sick to read: the names of his friends, the titles of books he checked out from the library, the churches he attended, the bars where he drank, all documented with clinical precision. Someone had been watching him, not because he was dangerous, but because he had been categorized, sorted, filed under a threat assessment that never expired, never required review, never gave him a chance to defend himself. And Robert was not alone. The declassified documents reveal thousands of similar cases, ordinary people marked for attending meetings, for signing petitions, for donating to causes that someone in an office deemed suspicious. The criteria for being added to these lists were never clearly defined, never subject to judicial oversight, never bound by any standard that a reasonable person could predict or avoid. You could be flagged for association, for living near someone already on a list, for sharing a last name with someone under investigation, for patterns of behavior that algorithms identified as anomalous without ever explaining what normal was supposed to look like. And once you were on the list, there was no process for removal, no appeal, no expiration date, just a permanent notation that followed your identification number through every database that checked your background. The psychological impact of discovering this, decades after the fact, is difficult to articulate. It is the retroactive poisoning of memory, the realization that your life was not entirely your own, that you were being watched during moments you believed were private. Robert described it as a kind of violation that felt worse than physical intrusion, because it meant that every choice he made, every relationship he formed, had been observed and recorded by strangers who made judgments about his character without ever meeting him. The legal framework that allowed this was built on interpretations of national security that gave agencies broad discretion to monitor anyone they deemed relevant to investigations that were themselves classified. The Church Committee hearings in the 1970s exposed some of these programs, revealed the scope of domestic surveillance conducted by the FBI, CIA, and military intelligence against civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and political but exposure did not mean ending. It meant adaptation. The programs continued under different names, with different legal justifications, with technologies that made surveillance cheaper, easier, and far more comprehensive than anything available in the analog era. The watch lists grew, expanding from thousands of names to hundreds of thousands. And the criteria for inclusion became even more opaque as automated systems began flagging people based on data patterns rather than human judgment. If you subscribe to this channel, you will continue to see investigations into how these systems evolved, how they operate today, and how the logic of permanent monitoring has become embedded in the infrastructure of modern life. The transition from paper files to digital databases did not just change the medium of surveillance, it changed the nature of it, because digital records never fade, never suffer from the inefficiencies that once limited how thoroughly a person could be tracked. Every transaction you make, every border you cross, every flight you book, every website you visit, generates data that feeds into systems designed to identify patterns, anomalies, associations that might indicate risk. And risk is defined broadly, not just as threat of violence, but as deviation from predictive models, as behavior that does not fit the profile of a compliant citizen, as thoughts expressed in private conversations that algorithms flag for review. The no-fly list, the terrorist screening database, the gang databases maintained by local police. These are the modern descendants of the watch lists that marked Robert and thousands like him, and they operate with even less transparency. People discover they are on these lists only when they are stopped at airports, denied entry to buildings, pulled over by police who have been alerted that their vehicle is associated with a flagged individual. There is no notification, no hearing, no clear path to removal. Just the sudden realization that you have been categorized as something other than trustworthy, and that categorization will follow you through systems you did not know existed. The emotional toll of this is profound. It creates a permanent state of uncertainty, a feeling that you must constantly prove your innocence without knowing what you are accused of or who is making the accusation. Sarah, a journalist who discovered her name on a watch list after repeated dissension at borders, described it as living with a question mark over your identity, never knowing when or how it would affect your life next. She had written articles critical of surveillance policy, had interviewed had attended conferences on civil liberties, and somewhere in that record of perfectly legal activity, an analyst or an algorithm decided she warranted monitoring. Her emails were read, her phone calls were logged, her movements were tracked, not because she had committed a crime, but because she had made herself interesting to people whose job is to find threats in oceans of data. And T, for what makes someone interesting, is not something the public gets to debate. It is determined behind closed doors by agencies that answered to oversight committees that rarely push back. The chilling effect of knowing this is real, measurable in the choices people make about what to say, where to go, who to associate with. Calculations of risk that shape behavior even in the absence of direct enforcement. This is how surveillance functions as control, not by punishing everyone, but by making everyone aware that punishment is possible, that the line between monitored and unmarked is invisible and could be crossed at any moment. The legal concept of innocent until proven guilty does not apply to watch lists. You are guilty of being potentially guilty, marked for what you might do based on statistical models and human hunches that are never tested in court. And because these systems are classified as national security tools, they are largely immune to the constitutional protections that would normally prevent the government from maintaining files on citizens engaged in lawful activity. The Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable search was written for a world of physical spaces and tangible papers, not for a world where your entire life exists as data that can be searched without ever entering your home. The courts have struggled to adapt these protections, often ruling that you have no reasonable expectation of privacy in information you share with third parties, which in the digital age means almost everything about you is fair game. Your location data, your purchase history, your internet searches, your social media connections, all of it can be collected, analyzed, and used to build a profile that determines how you are categorized by systems you will never see. And the private sector has become a willing partner in this. Corporations that profit from surveillance, capitalism, selling access to data that makes government monitoring infinitely more efficient than it was in Robert's era. The fusion centers that combine federal, state, and local law enforcement with private security and corporate intelligence create a total information awareness that the public was told had been discontinued decades ago, but it was never discontinued. It was distributed, outsourced, normalized to the point where people carry tracking devices voluntarily and feed their lives into platforms designed to extract and monetize every detail. The difference between being monitored by the state and being monitored by corporations is increasingly meaningless when the data flows freely between them through subpoenas, purchases, and partnership agreements. And the consequence of this fusion is that there is no longer a distinction between being a customer, a citizen, and a suspect. You are all three simultaneously, sorted into risk categories that determine what opportunities are available to you. Robert spent the last years of his life trying to understand why he had been marked, filing more FOIA requests, reaching out to others who had been listed, trying to find some pattern or logic that would make sense of it. He never found one, because the system was not designed to make sense. It was designed to be comprehensive, to err on the side of over-inclusion, to operate on the principle that it is better to watch 1,000 innocent people than to miss one guilty person. But the cost of that principle is borne entirely by the innocent, who lose opportunities, who live under suspicion, who internalize the belief that they must be guilty of something if the system has marked them. The psychological literature on this is clear. Persistent surveillance produces anxiety, self-centered social withdrawal, and a degradation of the sense of autonomy that is essential to human dignity. You begin to see yourself through the eyes of your watchers, to judge your own actions by whether they might be misinterpreted, to avoid anything that could be construed as suspicious even when you are doing nothing wrong. This is the panopticon made real. The prison where the guards need not be present because the prisoners have internalized the gaze and police themselves more effectively than any external force could. And once this logic is embedded in the infrastructure of society, it is nearly impossible to remove because the systems are distributed, the data is replicated, the watchers are legion and mostly automated. The artificial intelligence that now handles much of this sorting operates on training data that reflects all the biases, errors, and overreach of the systems that came before, amplifying them at scale. If you were flagged once, even in error, that flag becomes part of the dataset that trains the next generation of algorithms, perpetuating the mistake indefinitely and applying it to anyone whose profile resembles yours. This is not accountability. This is the automation of injustice, the transformation of human prejudice and bureaucratic paranoia into code that runs without oversight or appeal. And the companies building these systems market them as objective, as neutral, as scientific, when in reality they are encoding the same surveillance logic that marked Robert for standing in a crowd 50 years ago. The difference is scale, where once it required human analysts to read files and make decisions. Now it requires only electricity and storage to watch everyone all the time and flag those who deviate from pattern. We have built the architecture of total surveillance and called it progress, convenience, security, when what we have actually built is a cage whose bars are made of data and whose locks are algorithms we do not understand and cannot contest. The moral question this raises is not whether surveillance can prevent harm. Sometimes it can, but whether a society that watches everyone all the time can remain free in any meaningful sense. Because freedom is not just the absence of punishment, it is the presence of space to think, to explore, to make mistakes, to change your mind without fear that your past will be weaponized against your future. And that space is disappearing, compressed by systems that remember everything, that connect everything, that reduce human complexity to risk scores and threat assessments. Robert died in 2009. Still on the list, still flagged in databases he could not access. His name passed from paper to microfilm to magnetic tape to solid-state storage, migrating through generations of technology, but never erased. His children discovered this when they tried to access his full file after his death, and found that even in death, he remained categorized, that the surveillance had never ended, had simply continued documenting his diminishing activity until there was nothing left to watch. This is the permanence of digital marking. There is no statute of limitations on data, no natural decay, no forgetting, just endless retention in systems that grow more interconnected with each passing year. And every person reading this, every person watching this, is generating that same permanent record right now, feeding data into systems that will categorize you, assess you, mark you if you cross invisible thresholds you cannot know. The question is not whether you have something to hide. The question is whether you trust the people who will inherit these systems, who will interpret your data decades from now when the context has been lost and only the pattern remains. The question is whether you believe that a society can be both free and totally transparent to its authorities. whether privacy is a right or a privilege that can be revoked in the name of security. The question is whether you are comfortable living in a world where your children will grow up never having known what it felt like to move through public space without generating a trail to be forgotten. These are not hypothetical concerns. They are the reality we are building, one data set at a time, one surveillance camera at a time, one algorithm at a time, with very little public debate about where this ends. Robert's story is a warning, not from the past, but about the future. About what happens when the tools of surveillance become so powerful and so cheap that watching everyone becomes the default rather than the exception. It is a warning that the distance between citizen and suspect is shorter than we imagine, that the criteria for suspicion are broader than we would believe, that the systems designed to protect us can just as easily be used to control us. And it is a warning that once you are marked, once you enter the files, once the algorithms flag your pattern, there may be no way out, no appeal, no mercy, just endless documentation of a life that was never quite your own. So when you think about privacy now, when you make choices about what to share, where to go, what to say, remember, Robert? Remember that someone is always building files, always categorizing, always watching. And ask yourself whether you are willing to live in a world where being noticed is a permanent condition, where your past is never past, where the watchers never sleep and the watched never rest. What does it feel like to know that your name might already be written in a file you will never see? And what would you want the right to know, to challenge, to erase if you could?